Hey everyone, Forrest here, and today we are going to do a setup guide on the Canon R5 Mark II. Let's dive in. So before I start, I want to say one quick disclaimer, and that is that we are not going to be talking about every single option in this camera. That would take a long time. The goal of this video is to get you up and running as quickly as possible, and moreover, up and running as quickly as possible for professional or prosumer use. We're going to get this camera from zero or a full reset. I've just reset this camera so it is in factory state as if I just turned it on, and we're going to go from that point to getting you ready to shoot professional quality photos with this camera. So after you open the camera or you initially reset it, we're going to be asked to input the language and then the date and the time. One quick note on time that I always like to remind people is that if you use multiple cameras, put your cameras next to each other and set the time exactly at the same time on all cameras. There's nothing more frustrating than if you're a dual camera shooter and the clock inside your camera on one camera is a minute or so off from the other one. When you import those pictures into your editing software and you sort by capture time, things are not actually sorted properly. So take the time to set your clock. Also, I'm not going to be talking about the app in this video, so I'm going to go ahead and cancel through that app setting. From here, I want to be able to see all of the options. So I'm going to hit the mode button at the top of the camera and put the mode of this camera on manual. If you're more comfortable with aperture priority or shutter priority, feel free to use AV or TV. I highly recommend AV though, or manual, as those are my two favorite modes of shooting. If you want to learn why, I've left a link to my basic exposure video series down below. Finally, I'm going to make sure on the outside of the camera that we are set to the photo mode right here on this little dial here, as we're not going to be going over video settings. From here, we're going to pop onto the back of the camera and dive into the menu. So the first menu option is the quality, and this is going to be the number one most important thing to change when setting up this camera. We're going to want to go down to image type and size, and instead of large, we're going to want to actually turn on no JPEG and turn on RAW instead. The way this works is one dial will control what RAW mode you're in, and one dial will control what JPEG mode we're in. We want the JPEG to be set to the little line and the RAW to be set to RAW. The R5 Mark II shoots phenomenal RAW images. If you don't know what RAW is, it is an image that is unprocessed, meaning out of the camera, a RAW photo will not look as good as a JPEG in many instances. However, RAW images have a ton of editability, meaning that you can go into your editing software of choice and really pull out way more detail than you would be able to with a JPEG or HEIF file format. The only time I wouldn't shoot RAW is if I didn't use an editing program. If you're someone who wants to go straight from the camera to maybe your phone app and then directly to the client, you might want to still shoot JPEG. However, for most users who are going to use some sort of editing software, RAW is going to be my go-to. Next, I'm going to make sure that cropping and aspect ratio is set to full. This just ensures that we're using the full surface of the sensor on the camera. Now we're going to skip over some of these settings, but I do want to draw special attention in setting group number 2 to the metering mode section. Now, as a mirrorless camera, metering has truly become a little bit less important because we do get a live preview of our exposure through the viewfinder. However, if you're an exposure purist and you still use something like zone system, this is when I would go into my metering mode and I would put the camera on spot metering if I was going to use the manual exposure mode on my camera. For me, I usually use the live histogram in the camera to judge my exposure, so I actually prefer to leave my meter on evaluative. Evaluative metering is Canon's version of smart metering. Nikon calls it matrix metering, where it reads the entire scene and judges a proper exposure that will average out to make everything look as properly bright or dark as it should be. The only other setting that I want to point out in here is ISO. We can select ISO speed settings, and we'll note that the camera defaults to auto ISO. We can go into auto and we can manually key in an ISO here. I do want to point out, however, that you also can adjust your ISO by using the dial on the camera. By default, this back dial right here that you would normally hit with your thumb is set to be your ISO control. So you can see as I turn that right here, we can see the ISO changing. I personally do really like auto ISO, but only for certain situations. Watch my sports photography video to learn more about that. In most instances, I'm going to be defaulting to leaving my ISO at the base of 100. Continuing on to menu number 3, we have a couple things here. So picture style doesn't matter because we're shooting raw. However, I will say if you want to adjust your picture style, what this does do is it affects the preview that you see on the back of the camera. So I know a lot of people, maybe when you're getting into shooting black and white and you're learning about how black and white photography works, I recommend those folks put their camera on monochrome picture style. This is gonna make it appear as though your camera is shooting black and white images. However, when you import them into your editing software, they're gonna go back to color. So you actually have all of that original good editability of a raw photograph, but on the back of the camera, you can see a live black and white preview, which is pretty cool. For most things though, I'm gonna leave this on standard as I wanna not really have any camera processing happening to the preview of my images on the back of the screen. Color space doesn't matter because we're shooting raw. Clarity, I'm gonna leave it 0. I'm gonna leave these things off. All right, going on to number 4. So here's one I would definitely change is white balance. I always am gonna adjust my white balance to daylight. I leave my camera on the daylight white balance all the time. And the reason is that daylight will not add any color cast to your images. So whatever color of light you're photographing under, that color will come through in your images. Now, sometimes that's bad, but we can fix it in post-production using your editing software because we're shooting raw. Now, the exception to this is if you are a JPEG shooter, then I would always take the time to manually go in and adjust your white balance to the situation that you're shooting under, to the lighting that you're shooting under. But for raw shooters, I'm just gonna leave mine on daylight all the time. Now you may say, well, Forrest, why wouldn't we use auto? Well, auto white balance is good too. The problem with auto is every picture will have a different white balance. So auto detects the lighting in the scene or tries to, and it says, oh, there's a little bit too much blue. Let's add some orange to compensate. The problem is if every photo is different, it makes it really hard to fix all of the photos in post-production in bulk. You have to almost season each photo to taste to get the perfect white balance. So daylight gives me consistency through my white balance, through my images, and it makes it way easier to fix in post-production. Cruising on through, we're gonna go to setting number 6 in the red section, and this is where drive mode lives. Now, drive mode is very important for some genres of photography, it's less important for others. I'm gonna recommend most people go to just standard high-speed continuous, normal continuous, or single shot. Now, all this controls is when you push the shutter button on the camera and you hold down the shutter, how many pictures do you want it to take? On single shoot, it's just gonna take one picture. If you hold the finger down for a long time, it's still only gonna take one shot. Whereas if you're on continuous high plus, you're gonna get a ton of frames per second. So I really think this depends on the genre of shooting that you're getting into. For most portrait wedding folks, you're probably gonna be fine with low speed continuous or even single shooting. But if you're getting into sports or something like that, you're probably gonna wanna go to high speed or high speed plus. Overall, just play with it, see what works for you. I know sometimes I'll go shoot sports and I'll be on high speed plus and I'll hold down that shutter button, I take 40 photos. Well, when I get into editing, it means I have to go through 40 pictures that look almost the same. So for me, I base my continuous shooting speed off of the subject matter that I'm shooting, and moreover, how quickly the subject matter that I'm shooting is moving. Faster the movement, the faster the continuous shooting mode that I like to use. One other thing I'll mention is that the R5 Mark II does have pre-continuous shooting. This means that it will actually always be shooting and it will allow you to essentially go back in time. So if you do enable this, your camera is gonna burn through batteries a lot quicker. However, if something cool happens, say at a sporting event, you say, oh my gosh, that was cool, and you immediately press the shutter, the camera will have already recorded some images before you even depress the shutter. So it's a very cool feature. This has been a thing on action cameras for quite some time. I'm glad to see it coming here into our professional mirrorless cameras as well. One other thing I like to mention in here is release shutter without card. I highly recommend everybody disables this. This is going to prevent you from taking photos if you do not have a memory card inside the camera. We want to prevent you from doing that. I've done whole shoots, I actually haven't, luckily, but I've almost done whole shoots where I've shot the whole shoot not having a memory card in, and the camera lets me keep taking photos. So I really like to turn that off so that it will not let you release the shutter, take a picture without a card inserted. And I know we are skipping some options here. That's because I want to get you guys up and running as quickly as possible with this camera. I will say, if you guys have learned something, please drop a like down below. I would really appreciate it. It helps our channel grow, helps us make more videos like this. So moving along, let's talk a little bit about the autofocus settings in the AF section. Now, I want to make something really clear. For most photographers, and I want to stare deep into your eyes, so look at me, look into my eyes. For most photographers, the default autofocus settings are perfect. Don't worry about it. Don't spend time trying to think that you're not using the most autofocus performance out of your camera. Use the defaults. For the most part, there's some things we're gonna tweak, but the defaults, for the most part, are great. Now, with that said, if you are a sports photographer or an action photographer or a wildlife photographer, there's a lot of tuning that we can do in the camera to make things better. Now, that tuning is very, very precise. It's very, very in-depth, so it's not gonna be something that we cover here in this video. However, I do wanna cover the broad overarching autofocus topics for everybody. So in this camera, when we get into those AF settings, the first and most important AF setting is gonna be servo versus AI focus versus one shot. Now, this is very simple. This determines how long or how much the camera will continually focus when you have the focus button held down. Now, you may be saying the focus button. Well, for most of us, the focus button is just the shutter button. So when we have the shutter button halfway pressed, how do we want the camera to behave with focus? Now, it defaults to servo, and I actually like that, but I want to make clear what this means. When we're on servo mode, that means that if you have the focus button depressed, and again, by focus button, I mean the shutter button at half press or the back button focus button. If you want to learn more about back button focus, check out a link down below in the description, or the back button focus button depressed. As long as you have that focus button held down, the camera will be continually refocusing on whatever's in your focus point. So if your focus point's in the middle and you hold down that button, the camera's going to be continually refocusing on whatever you point it at. So this is great servo mode for anybody who shoots moving subjects. If you're a sports photographer, totally have it on servo. Anytime we're gonna be worrying about movement and people moving and running and things like that, servo is gonna be the right choice. Now, if you're shooting stationary subjects, like say you're a product photographer, product photography, I'd probably use manual focus, but say you're a product photographer who wants to use autofocus. This is where we're gonna go into AF operation and we're gonna change it to one shot. Now, one shot means that when you push the focus button, even if you hold it down for 10 seconds, it's gonna focus one time and then it's gonna stop trying to focus. So it's great for stationary subjects. It prevents your camera from doing that autofocus hunting where you can kind of hear it or you can see it always kind of searching for focus. Servo will lead it to do that. One shot, it's just gonna find focus and then it's gonna be done, okay? Additionally, the other thing that I want to recommend that you guys change in here is your AF area, okay? Now, by default, I have my camera set here to flexible zone AF1. And you can see there's lots of different AF zones. I personally am a single point autofocus person. I like my autofocus to be one point that I can control where it goes very easily. So I'm gonna set mine to 1 point AF. What that means is if I go here to the back, I have a single autofocus point here in the center of my screen. I can move it with my finger if I touch here. I can also move it around with the thumbstick on the back of the camera. And whatever's in that little square, that's what's the camera's going to focus on when I push the focus button. Finally, the last thing I'm gonna recommend in here is that we go to whole area tracking servo AF and we turn that off. That is gonna return this camera to a more traditional autofocus style where again, that center point is gonna be what it tries to focus on. Again, season this to taste. If you're not a stationary subject photographer and you're shooting fast moving stuff, I'm not saying that these settings are gonna be the best for you. You need to play with it, you need to say what works, but this will give you a good, simple starting place for your autofocus that won't lead to confusion and frustration down the line. I'm actually gonna skip through all the rest of the focus settings. We're gonna talk more about a couple more focus things when we get into buttons. Now we're going to get into playback. I'm not going to talk about any of these playback settings. None of them really matter. This is just how your camera plays back images. There's some cool things in here, but nothing that we need to worry about to get up and running. We have the network settings section, the network function to connect your camera to a network. We're going to skip through all that. And finally, we're going to get to the file and card settings, the little wrench. And this is where there's some more stuff that I want to talk a little bit about. Now, for the most part, the defaults are great in here, which I'm very thankful for. But I do want to point a couple things out on this page. First off is under record function and card folder select. If you are an event photographer or a photographer who shoots things that only happen once, they're not a repetitive event that you could shoot again, okay? Say you're a wedding photographer. I highly recommend that you make full use of the 2 card slots that are present inside of the R5 Mark II. This camera has 2 card slots. The 2 card slots are awesome. Buy 2 matching cards of matching capacity and put them in here. And then go into your settings and go to record function and card folder select, go to photo record options and set it to record to multiple. This is going to tell the camera that every time you take a picture, you want 1 copy of the photo to go on one card and 1 copy to go on the other card. The biggest reason I see photographers lose images if they have a good, consistent backup workflow, which you should if you are in those genres of photography, is memory card failure. Cameras with single memory card slots are really at the mercy of a single memory card failure and you losing all of your pictures. So please don't just buy a 2 memory card slot camera and use one of the slots. Always go into your card folder select, go to photo record options and set it to record to multiple. That way, every time you take a picture, you have an automatic backup. The other thing that I want to mention in here is formatting your cards. Now, I want to make something very clear. Formatting your cards erases all of the data on the card. So don't do this if you don't want to get rid of the data on this card. But here's the deal. I've seen more photographers lose images and get corrupted images by not formatting their memory cards on the camera they are going to shoot with than anything else. So my practice is before any shoot, I take a card, I put it in this camera, I format it, and then I go to the shoot. Now, again, formatting erases, so don't put a card in with pictures on it that you need, like put a new blank card or a card with stuff you can delete on it, format it, and then go on your shoot. And I'll point out in here that when you do go to format, it's gonna ask you which slot you'd like to format. You wanna format both slots if you are using that dual card functionality. So take the time to format your cards. It's gonna protect you down the line. I'm gonna skip through the rest of those yellow settings and we're gonna get into the green customized controls. There's not too much I wanna change in here, but I do wanna point out for those of you who are back button focus users, those of you who like to use the AF on button right here for your focus instead of the shutter button, the way we can turn that on is just going into customize buttons for shooting. And right now we can see that the shutter button, which is this first button here, is set to autofocus and metering. We want to go into this and we want to adjust it to just be metering. So now the shutter button is metering, and then if I scroll down here, we can see that the AF on button is set to autofocus. So this is how we want to have things set. Again, here is our shutter button right here. It's set to just the little metering. And then down here on AF on, it's set to AF and metering. Now, I like to go one step further because I really like the face and eye detection in these cameras. So what I like to do is go down to the star button, which is not a button most people use. If you use the star button, no shame, right? Use it. But most people, that's a button they don't really utilize. I'm gonna go into my star button customization, and I'm gonna set my star button to be my eye detection autofocus, not the eye control, because that's a different thing. Eye detection, the little eye AF. And I'm gonna select that. Now what this means is I have 2 options. If I push the AF on button when I'm shooting, it's gonna focus on whatever's in that little square, just like normal autofocus. But if you are photographing a person, you can push the star button and that will focus on any eyes it detects in the photo. And the reason I like both is because sometimes if you have a group of people, it doesn't know which eyes to focus on. So you can't always rely on eye detection. So having a standard focus button to fall back on is great. However, if you're photographing one person, eye detection will work great and it'll be more precise at aligning itself than the standard AF. So again, in my menu, in my custom buttons, I like the shutter button to just do metering. I like the AF on button to do autofocus and metering. And finally, I like the star button to just do eye detect autofocus. The last thing that I'd like to mention is just the My menu at the end. That's the green star. I love the My menu. It lets you customize all of those menu options that we've talked about, throw away the ones you don't want, and just get to the specific menu options that you care the most about. So in the My menu, I'm gonna go to Add My Menu tab. It's gonna add My Menu 1. You can have multiple menu tabs. I'm then gonna set to Configure My Menu 1, the menu that I just made, and I'm gonna say Select Items to Register. And this is gonna show us a list of every menu setting in the camera. You can see how long that little scroll wheel is, right? It's insanely long. We can set which menu options we would like to be on the My menu. So as an example, I know that I commonly like to change my ISO. So I am gonna set ISO speed to be in the My menu. I'm gonna say, okay, and there it is. Now, I also like to change my metering mode. So I'm gonna go to metering mode and adjust that and put that in the My menu. And coming down here, I like to adjust my white balance. Actually, I don't, I usually leave it on daylight, but let's just say I do. I'm gonna set that to the My menu. And now if I go back one more, we can see that in My Menu 1, there are the 3 settings that we've asked for. So without going deep into the menu, we can just go to the My menu and get to exactly what we're looking for. I also want to point out on this camera that there is the Q or the quick menu. If you tap that, it turns the outside of the screen into a little touch controller where we can adjust things like autofocus modes, we can adjust things like image quality, drive modes, white balance, all this stuff. So if you don't want to hop into the menu, the Q menu, the quick menu is a great way to come in and just change a couple of little things. Finally, I want to end with, if you mess up your camera and you feel like all things are going bad and you want to restart, you want to watch this video from square one, if you go into your menu and you go into the yellow wrench, there's a number second from the end, and the yellow wrench is reset camera. You can select that and do a factory reset, and that'll send this camera back to how it was from the factory. You do that, and then you watch through this video, you'll have a fully set up camera, at least the way that I would do it, with all the major settings already set, okay? So you guys, that's what I would do. If I got a R5 Mark II out of the box and I was looking to set it up, I'd walk through those things. There's obviously a lot more, but honestly, for most folks, I recommend you do all those things and you start shooting with it, see what bugs you, and then dive in the menu to fix those specific things. You all, I would really appreciate if you would drop a like down below. If you like this video and you want more photo and video education, hit subscribe in the lower right-hand corner. Turn on that bell for notifications if you would, please. And I will catch you in the next one. If you guys have any comments, leave them down below as well. There's also a link to our photography community down in the description, as well as some links to other useful videos that might help you in your photographic journey. Thanks everybody, and I'll catch you in the next one.